Welcome all of you early birds that have registered and are dropping in, all 25 of you already for today's C-SPEN webinar. We will be starting promptly at 2 o'clock this afternoon. So welcome to all of you. We will do the normal and obligatory reminders with regard to the utilization of the resources at 10 minutes before the hour, 5 minutes before the hour, and as we start. So looking forward to sharing time with you yet again this afternoon as we walk through new guidance from the Department of Education and also a how-to on going through the application process for the Higher Education Emergency Relief Funds. We'll be back with you shortly. Well, good afternoon once again, everybody. It's 5 minutes before the top of the hour and the start of the next in the series of C-SPEN CARES Act webinars. This one on the Department of Education's new guidance, as well as how to complete your submission for the HERF emergency relief funds now for the students, as well as discussion about how you can work towards the submission of your second half for the institutional portion of those funds as well. We'll be starting in about another 5 minutes. A couple of the normal reminders. We will be recording all of this presentation so that you can receive it and review it at your leisure following the presentation today. That information will be available immediately, almost immediately following today's presentation on our C-SPEN website. We will talk a little bit briefly at the end of today's webinar about some of the upcoming series that we'll have for you next week, including another vital support for our community with regard to the transition to online education sponsored by Pearson, and a conversation with myself and other panelists on the review of the CARES Act. So more to follow. We'll get started here in about another 5 minutes. Welcome everybody who's joined thus far. Well, good afternoon, everybody, and once again, welcome to today's sixth in a series of CARES Act higher education webinars that we've been doing through C-SPEN. Today's webinar will cover the areas of the new Department of Education guidance released just days ago and new FAQs that have been put forward, as well as an endeavor to walk you through the registration process for those higher education relief funds. We'll get started here in about another 2 minutes. A couple of reminders for you. You have the drop down for questions, and we encourage you to utilize that. We will try and answer questions at the end of today's webinar. And if we have questions that we don't have the answers to, we will take those down and share them with our friends at the Department of Education and within the community and seek out those answers and then share them with all of you. We also will be audio taping and videoing this entire presentation, which will be put up on C-SPEN's website shortly after, if not almost immediately after today's presentation. So look for that to review at your leisure, maybe to go back and refresh yourself with some of the slides or maybe some of the links to the new and additional information. We'll get started here in just another 2 to 3 minutes. Well, welcome everybody to today's CARES Act C-SPAN webinar. We will focus on the sixth of our presentations dealing with the department's new guidance and the Higher Education Emergency Relief Act funding and how the registration process for those funds takes place on a various number of different websites and access points. We're going to go ahead and get started. As we always do, we want to remind you that this presentation, as well as all prior presentations, are available to you on our C-SPAN website. We have all of those archived for your capability to review. We've done a number of different presentations thus far, everything from assistance most recently on the notice of proposed rulemaking and new information for distance education, which is hopefully useful to you all as you've converted to online education to try and sustain the capabilities for your students. We also have had a past presentation on the Americans with Disabilities Act and how to utilize that both for your presentations as well as for your website, and certainly 3 other reviews of the CARES Act as the information came out from everything from the March 27th actual enactment of the CARES Act to the various guidance that's been provided by the Department of Education. We do propose the opportunity for you to ask us questions. So if you please use the question and answer key on the right-hand side or the top or the bottom, depending on how your system is set up. We will be trying to answer questions throughout today's presentation at the end. And then if there are questions that we don't have the answers to, we will seek those opportunities to review those questions with members of our community and individuals within the Department of Education, and then share all of those with all the registrants and participants on today's call. I see already some questions coming in. We'll answer those when we get to the end. So without further ado, let's begin today's presentation. We're going to cover hopefully a lot of ground with you all today. The first portion that we're going to speak to is the new guidance. On April 21st, just a mere 2 days ago, information came out that is very, very important to all of our community, not only with additional guidance on the student portion of the Higher Education Emergency Relief Fund under the CARES Act, but also new guidance on the institutional component, the other 50% of those funds that can be utilized by your institution, and some additional guidance in the form of 2 FAQs that the Department of Education put forward. After we get through that and a conversation and discussion about some of that information, we will then attempt to walk you through in relatively rudimentary form, not to insult your intelligence, but hopefully to help many of you who have gotten stuck at various points as we understand it in the application and submission process as you attempt to register for both the student and then the institutional components of those funds. We'll talk more about why I say students versus the institutional as we get into the presentation here in just a minute. We'll then have an opportunity for Q&A and send you along your way for this afternoon, and the opportunity for you to hopefully utilize some of this information and continue to work your way through all of the challenges and all of the opportunities that come with the CARES Act and the various aspects of the CARES Act. So without further ado, here's the actual press release that came out 2 days ago from the Department of Education when Secretary DeVos announced that the Department of Education was providing guidance on the institutional component of the CARES Act, Higher Education Stabilization, Higher Education Emergency Relief Funds funding, and HERF, we live in a world of acronyms, is now the term that you'll hear used for those Higher Education Emergency Relief Funds. It's the new acronym that is working its way around Washington, D.C., and certainly probably with many of you in the community as well. In the announcement, the Secretary, as well as Deputy Secretary Diane Howard-Jones and Assistant Secretary King, provided some additional new information, not only in their presentation to higher education stakeholders that we were a participant in later that afternoon, but also in the form of new guidance that they put in print. We're going to focus on the print version of that information as it is things that you have the ability to go back and review yourself. A key place that especially you that are in the financial aid realm, but probably all of you on this call should have on literally on your bookmarks for your websites is this access point, which is on the Department of Education's website. It's literally a portion of the Higher Education Department of Education's website that speaks to specifically to the HERF, to the Higher Education Relief Fund. And if you go to that site, this is what you're going to see in terms of a great deal of additional information that's available there. And why I share this with you is because this is where a lot of the information that we're going to talk about today is drawn from. Here you can see that it talks about the student side of the funding, and then the new edition that came on the 21st is this whole section here where it talks specifically about the funding from the institutional side. Combined, these two portions of this page give you basically all of the information that the department has put forward with regard to the higher education emergency relief funds. Initially, this was guidance that they added on the weekend of Easter that we all immediately went to try and determine how we were going to do the submission of what we thought initially was going to be a relatively easy registration, funding, certification, and agreement, but have certainly come to find out that there is a lot more to it, and there are a great deal more steps in the process in order to complete the grants.gov submission. And even these tips and this additional guidance kind of fall short on literally what it takes to complete the process. But here you get that information along with the original letter from the secretary a week ago that covered the student side, the certification agreement that you have to fill out and complete. We'll talk specifically about one area in that PDF that institutions may have done wrong and you may need to correct and when you update. And then one of the two things that we're going to go about today is a review of the frequently asked questions. This one updated here from the student perspective and down here from the institutional perspective as well. Here, once again, is the information with regard to the institutional portion of those funds and the new information that has come out linked to that as well. So sliding that back over to the left, there is once again the actual link that you can utilize to get to the slides to the presentation that I just provided to you. But in terms of the drill down, where we're going to go first is the FAQ for the students. And in the process of putting this forward, this has now been updated twice by the Department of Education. So we anticipate that not only will this for the students continue to be updated as more questions and answers are added to it, but the institutional version of it that we're going to talk about in just a few minutes will be updated as well. As it stands right now, this document, if you were to go back onto the department's webpage and open it up to review it, it would look like this. And would include 10 pages of questions that are provided and list of answers to those questions that have come from the Department of Education, 5 pages that have 13 questions that come from the various community as it relates to the Department of Education. Looking through this, there's a number of answers to questions that were important to our community. The one I'll draw your attention to first, because it's one that everybody within the proprietary realm has been asking because it applies directly to our community and to our students and institutions, is question number 10. Will funds provided through the CARES Act be included in an institution's 90-10 calculation? The department says very specifically and very directly that funds paid directly to institutions by the department through the HERF will not be included as revenue for the purposes of the 90-10 calculation. So this question right here certainly speaks to a number of the initial questions we had, and certainly much to the frustration, I believe, of those within the Democratic Party, Minority Whip Durbin, Miss Warren, Senator Warren, Senator Brown, and Blumenthal, who put forth a request that not only should our institutions not be eligible to receive these funds, but that if in fact the interpretation of the department was that we were eligible to receive and utilize these funds, that a number of guardrails be put up, not the least of which was having all of these funds included in the 90-10 calculation. The department makes very clear with this statement that those funds will not be included. But there's a lot of other questions that are answered as a portion of these 5 pages as well. It talks a lot about what the do's and don'ts are for the funds. And one of the things that I call your attention to, and you'll hear repeatedly from not only myself, but from many others, is the overall rationale for the utilization of the funds under the CARES Act. And it's highlighted right here in this particular portion of the lead-in or the overview for the questions. And it speaks to the fact that all of the funds that are provided under the HERF should be used to provide emergency assistance for expenses related to the disruption of campus operations due to the COVID virus. One of the things we're starting to see is the department putting some framework in terms of definitions and timelines around a lot of this information. So as you go through this, whether you're talking about the student side or the institutional side of the funds, you need to be aware that all of it needs to be in the context of and the rationale utilized for the expenditure of these funds needs to be with the perception and justification that it is that the expenses are either as a relation to or being funded or reimbursed as a result of the changes that have and the disruptions that have occurred and with regard to the education of students as the utilization of these funds. Several of the questions, again, you can see here the very first question was one that many institutions have been clamoring for, which is guidance on whether or not the funds provided to students in the form of room and board, tuition and fees, and others can be utilized and be paid for or reimbursed to the institution by the student funds. The answer to that is an unequivocal no. But we'll talk about on the institutional side how the institutional funding can be used for some of these. But what is important to note here is that in many, many instances, the department makes it emphatic that the student portion of the funds are to go to students and therefore are not monies that you as an institution can somehow seek to have returned to you, even for obligations that the student has. The department has recognized, and the statute provides for you as an institution to utilize the institutional 50% for those type of costs, those type of circumstances, again, as a result of the changes you as an institution have had to make as a result of the pandemic and the virus and all of the changes and conversions to technology and online distance education that you've had to do. Speaking of that, they address another question very early on with regard to that technology. Hardware and software issues and concerns are part of question number 2, where they talk about whether or not you as an institution can be reimbursed for laptops or other hardware or information technology that you as an institution, once again, may have purchased or is given to the students. And this is where some of those timelines start to come in. The department says that unfortunately, no, once again, you cannot ask for the student to utilize their portion of those funds for the purposes of the technology that they may be utilizing. But again, on the institutional side, you can utilize your portion, the institutional portion of those funds. I'm not going to insult your intelligence by going through all of these, but certainly I would encourage you to go through and review all 13 of these questions and answers that are provided for on the student side as portions of what you review. By way of encapsulating those, we do have a brief summary of what those include on the next slide. Here is the key takeaways from those 5 pages and 13 plus questions. Students must be Title IV eligible. This was another major definitive statement that was made both during the higher education stakeholders presentation by Secretary DeVos, Diane Howard-Jones, and Mr. King. It says specifically, and they noted specifically, that individuals that are either have received federal student financial aid under Title IV are those that are eligible, even if they haven't received the aid, are those that can have access to the student funds, meaning institutions with programs that are non-Title IV eligible, and those students are not eligible to participate. It specifically speaks in the guidance that I showed you previously that the definition or the term for eligibility is simply that an individual was eligible to submit and complete the FAFSA, and the sections 484 of the Higher Education Act that delineate what those criterion are. As you may well know, if you're an FSA or just know from all of your time spent, that includes that the individual can show a social security number, immigration documentation, or other forms of verification that they've completed a high school diploma, GED, or the equivalent in terms of homeschooling. So one key area that we now have further guidance on from the student perspective is that the student aspect of the funds should be utilized by you, the institution, to go to only those that are eligible to receive federal student financial aid. Secondly, again, as I talked about, it talks in a number of areas where the student portion cannot be used to reimburse you as an institution for things that are outside of the student side of the process, but we'll talk more about that in just a second. And so you see here the various different things that are part of that particular set of circumstances. The last of these, institutions must provide emergency grant assistance through a process used to pay for the credit balances to students. Again, I think that was another major question that many of the institutions had. So we focused on that and sharing that information to you as well. Going backwards, I'll show you very quickly, once again, going into the web page that I already alluded to. Here is the institutional version of this. Once again, an FAQ specifically for the institutional portion of the funds, and 4 pages of information and 10 questions that have been answered here. This is where you can see that the information that schools were asking for on whether or not reimbursement of things that you have done as an institution could or could not be reimbursed from the funds. And again, the student side being one half, the institutional side being the other. The utilization of your institutional funds can cover a number of the costs that schools have been asking about. You see here under question number 3, may the institution use may the institutions that have provided refunds to students for room and board, tuition, and other activities reimburse themselves from the funds from the institutional cost portion of the HERF? And the answer there, unlike the no from the student side, is here a yes. But it does come with the disclaimer that those funds needed to be with regard to decisions and determinations made that were, once again, as a result of the disruption of activities and changes as a result of the pandemic, and that those funds must be funds that were that they reimburse themselves for funds previously made to students on or after March 13th of 2020. This is the date that the president proclaimed that the national emergency began, and is the date that the department is tying a great deal of their determinations and information to. I suspect that as we look for and receive additional guidance from the department related to leave of absences, Title IV funding as it relates to R2T4 calculations, and much more, will also be tied to this date as well. But for the purposes of continuing to go through this document in brief, it shows here that you can use the apportionment, the allocation for the institution, not only for reimbursement to yourself of costs that you provided to students, but also those laptops and other forms of technology that you may have provided to your students as well. Again, the hinge-pin is that it has to be institutional cost purchased of those computers or the equipment on or after, and donated to students on or after March 13th, 2020. If you unfortunately purchase those ahead of that date and utilize them for students, by the strict interpretation here, those funds are not, you're not eligible to reimburse yourself for those determinations and those things that you provided to the students prior to that date. I'm sure that there will be questions and there'll be continuations of whether or not there might be the opportunity for a waiver or an application for an appeal process. One of the things that you can certainly point to is that the early outset of the COVID pandemic did precede that March 13th date, specifically out in Washington State, Oregon, and the upper Northwest where the pandemic first took hold. And we can go back and look at certainly information from entities like the University of Washington that preceded this date and may be a reason for a review of or an additional waiver or application process to come in the future. On the institutional side as well, another one of the questions that I've heard oftentimes is there have been some institutions that have already announced that they are going to utilize all 100% of their funds for student-related issues. It specifically speaks to this notion with question number 5. as to whether or not the institutional portion of the funds can be used for additional grant aid assistance to students. The answer to that, once again, is an unequivocal yes. And again, the guidance talks about how those funds should be administered, again, relating to cost of attendance related issues, and also the ability to tie those to the disruption of campus activities with regard to the education. It also includes a number of other key questions regarding the utilization of those funds. One that I'll call to your attention that deals with entities that have management agreements. There is a specific prescribed prohibition in the CARES Act as it relates to the institution's ability to use any of the funds for contracted pre-enrollment activities. That is specifically prohibited, along with the utilization of the institutional funds for endowments or for the utilization for capital costs as it relates to athletic dormitories and other information. That comes directly from the statute. But the department realizes that you could have circumstances where, as part of a combined contract, that you contract with an outside entity, both for support services and infrastructure for your LMS or for your computer related or your technology related information, as well as marketing, recruiting, and advertising through technology and online services and the like. Question 8 specifically speaks to this issue and whether or not and how an institution would address those concerns. It says, in short, that the institution would have the ability to utilize their institutional HERF funds for payment of the portions that deal specifically with technology and institutions, but not for those in dealing with marketing and recruiting and advertising. So they really have provided, even in this first tranche or this first FAQ from the institutional side, several key portions and components of information. One area that they didn't really address as much as I think people would have liked comes in question number 9 with regard to whether or not and how the institutions are to report the collection and reporting of this information. It alludes to other portions of the HERF and specifically that additional guidance will be provided in this area. So it's one of the ones that I think, along with all of the policy-driven issues, that we'll look to see additional information coming out from the department in the days, weeks, and likely months to come. But summarizing that page as well, one of the things that they make clear is that an institution must first have executed, meaning submitted, fully submitted, all of their student certification documentation before being eligible to move forward in the submission of the request and the documentation for the institutional portion. Again, with the focus here being on ways in which to provide benefits to students and then you as the institution after the fact. So it states specifically that that process must be completed, meaning executed, submitted first before you can move on to then the submission of your secondary, which is why the second half of, we believe the second half of this presentation is hopefully of value to you. Again, it reiterates that the funds paid directly through the HERF funds to the institution are not counted as 90/10, and that the institution may use the funds that they receive under the institutional portion to cover a lot of the costs and a lot of the areas that institutions were asking about, not only laptops, hotspots, but for some room and board, tuition and other fees, as well as other costs. Now I'm going to take a deep breath and get into a review of the HERF registration process. And I think that the next 2 slides are kind of hopefully a visualization of what we thought versus what we have in the process of trying to register for these funds. As you can see here, I thought that the registration process was going to be relatively easy. Yes, it was going to come through an avenue different than what we maybe were used to, but as you read the early documents and the early guidance from the department before they did the updates with regard to the grants.gov requirements and so on, I thought that and hoped that it was going to be a relatively easy process. But I think more of us have fallen into alignment with this particular depiction of maybe the way the process has worked for us in general. We've come to learn that there is a lot more complexity, a lot more steps, candidly, some housekeeping that might have gone along with the development and your efforts to continue to either try or succeed in the submission of your student applications. And as a result, C-SPEN is trying to help you and utilize the guidance that we've received from 3 to 4 of the individuals, FSA individuals, who have completed the process and taken the wealth of their information, attempted to put it in easily or more easily or readily discernible opportunities and source documents to try and help you use as a checklist or maybe a backstop for the process that your institutions are going through. Don't mean to insult your intelligence, but the best place to start is at the beginning and the initial registration requirements. These 3 paragraphs are taken directly from an initial registration of an organization document from the Department of Education, which would be happy to send along to you. But the data here, and I'm not going to go through it piece by piece, leads to the basic steps that you need to do to register your organization. Much of this you've done many, many years ago, but here's where the housekeeping part comes in. One of the things that we have come to find as a result of this process is that maybe over time, while you've been so involved in so many other responsibilities of the day-to-day operation of your institution, that maybe some of the information from your DUNS numbers to your SAMS numbers to the information on your e-car is not fully consistent with the information that is provided in this system. And it needs some cross-referencing and some cleanup. Your DUNS number is the number that you need to protect, because obviously your DUNS number related to your e-car is what orders you and enables you to get the funding for all of students through FSA through G5. So it's important to recognize and keep this information with regard to your DUNS number pristine as you go through this process, but recognize that there might be some of you who are going to have to go back and forth, not only with DUNS, but with SAM and the CAGE process that we'll talk about as well as this goes forward. If you have issues with DUNS, the way to go through it is to contact their website or to call them on the phone. This part of the process is one of the easier to remedy. If there are circumstances, DUNS has had an uptick in the number of calls because of clarifications or additional guidance needed. But even if there's something that needs to be taken care of here, you can normally complete it within a day to 2. The next part, harder to complete, longer to complete if there are issues or problems or concerns, is with your SAMS registration and your SAMS number and the CAGE process that's tied to the SAMS process. As you go through SAMS, you're going to need to get your SAMS number, make sure that information comports with your IRS forms, and making sure that all of the information is identical. One of the things that I've heard with regard to SAM, as well as with regard to some of the other issues here, is surnames and the registration of the various individuals with the administrative rights needs to be identical. Literally, schools have had to go back and make changes because you use Tom as opposed to my given name, Tommy, in the purposes and for the purposes of the information flow. And that one minor change in first name of surnames and things of that of names and the like literally kicked the information back, and it took them walking through things detailed in a very, very minute, finite way in order to catch that that was the glitch that was holding them up. So details do matter, and a lot of this is going to take making sure that everything is consistent across these various different platforms in order for you to complete the process. Again, as a form of housekeeping, that's not necessarily a bad thing. It's probably not something that you have on your tick list to do on a pretty regular basis. So some of this cleans up some of the potential inconsistencies you have between DUNS, SAM, the grant-aid.gov, and your FSA, e-car, and other information. Again, you always want to maintain the integrity of the information on your e-car and your DUNS number as you go through this process. Again, one of the areas that we found the problem that I alluded to was that the registrant and the person that has rights to access is the person that needs to complete this. If in fact you need to give authority and rights access to somebody other than the person who is the individual you have listed on SAMS, you need to go through and do another process to bring them into the fold, to give them authorization capabilities to do so. This will lengthen the process, but this is one of the areas where over time, some entities realized that the person they had listed was not the person that currently does it. Over time, individuals move on or changes are made. So this is another area where a stopgap alludes to or falls into this process. Once you get that, all of that information done and the cage process that goes with SAMS, then you can move on to registration.gov. And these are the very the steps that go along with that process. Again, all of this information is directly from the Department of Education and takes you through how the process should go. And I'm going to have some screenshots that share it with you here in just a minute. For some of you, this might be so rudimentary as to be a little bit frustrating to go through, but bear with me. Again, everybody needs to get all of these pieces before you can move forward. So you get through the 8 portions of the process and you go on to grants.gov and you need to fill out all of the information. This is where you're going to go for that initial registration. You can see that we've taken a screenshot of the first page and the initial phase of the process. As you go through, you're going to need to add a profile as part of the registration process. You have the ability to do 2 forms of registration. One is your organizational application profile, and the other is the individual application profile. The one that is most important and most relevant is the organizational side. After you get that information, you're going to have the ability to manage your profiles, and you'll go in here and either add a profile, which is down at the bottom, or manage your profiles. This is one of the pages that you will go to as part of creation of that profile. And once you do so, you will go in and provide the following information. Your DUNS number in the form of a unique entity identifier. What this really is, and what we've come to realize, is that that number is literally your DUNS number with 4 additional zeros attached to the end of it. But this becomes your unique identifier for the purposes of moving through this application process. There are times when you're going to find that this unique identifier, as you're going through this process, that passwords and this information, sometimes it is better to, once you've completed the steps in this process, to log out and log back in so that the system will take that information and hook it and tie it in. We've had circumstances where institutions try to move forward. They know they've submitted and have filled out the right information, but unless you go out and go back in, it doesn't seem to connect right away, and it slows you down in terms of trying to get through other steps in the process. As you go through, you'll create a profile, and this is where you would enter that information. If you have the circumstances in which you've successfully done so and you now need to assign the roles, you will get a temporary passcode. As I said before, when you get these temporary passcodes to put in, if in fact you find that it's not taking it, log out, log back in, and lo and behold, a reboot sometimes gives you the ability for that passcode to then, temporary passcode to then take. This is the information that you receive in the form of an email that gives you all of the various facets of the information that you filled out to make sure that it's correct, your login information, and then also the other contacts if there are issues or concerns. If by chance you get to this process and all of a sudden you get this default message, which you note that we were able to capture, because you're not alone if you get this. Many institutions, as they're going through this process, have had these problems where we often find if you get this default notification, it is your SAMS registration that either isn't complete or the system of the integration of that information with the other Department of Education information is normally found to have something incongruent. So we would encourage you, if unfortunately you get this default, to start with going back to your SAM and the cage process as where you might want to look to see whether or not there is some kind of hiccup or hang up in the process. Once you get through all that, you've gotten through the initial phase. Then you now have to move over to do another whole process, which is the eBiz registration process. All of that prior process, depending on where you have issues, could be as much as 3 days to a week and a half if you have problems with SAM. So that's where the longest period of time of application changes, modifications, and time to get the system to catch up takes place. Once you get to the eBiz process and then beyond the eBiz process into not only the defining of the roles in your profile, but then the grant application submission process, it flows a lot quicker. So I know that it sounds like those going through some of that was rather Pavlin for some of you, but again, that's where we have found that because of the SAMS number and the cage process, that's where we found that some of the longest time lags take place. When you go in to do your eBiz POC authorization, on the page you'll see the regular grant, and then it'll be a little caricature over to your right. You must complete this process. You do or do not have to go through Workspace. Workspace is utilized in order to provide you the opportunity, if you have a myriad of different people working on facets of the completion of the various documents and information, to house it like you would on Google Docs or other places, Google Drive, where everybody can have access to it and help meld all the information together. If it's just you going through the process, you can do it linearly on your own. These steps in the process, it asks you ultimately to determine the roles under this process. There are 3 roles that you can put forward. Literally all of the individuals that I've talked to just went ahead and filled out all 3 roles just to make sure that they didn't have an issue. You will see once again that your DUNS number and password become a key component of filling out the application information, and that there is additional management help information for you to follow. And ultimately, you get to the point where you'll see these and the ability, there's the PVC and the notion, but here's where you would actually click to do the eBiz process. As you go through this, once again, you will get a temporary passcode. This is exactly what that screenshot looks like of the information that you will get to then go and put in the various roles that you need to respond. If you have a problem with the password, and again, it kicks you to where it doesn't seem to be taking it, type in forgot password or hit the forgot password and type in the password, and for some reason that clicks you in sometimes quicker than going through the normal process. Again, these are some of the tricks to the trade, rebooting and going back through. The people that have been successful in completing the process have told me are things that you should do. Here is yet again the temporary codes that you will receive after you've completed the password process, and it takes you through that information. When you get to this step, you then will have a series of 2 to 3 screens that are totally institution specific. I don't have access, didn't want access to any of the individual institutions that have helped me put this together for their information. So this is where I'll talk just a brief second about 2 screens and 2 sets of steps that you'll have to go through using the information you previously were assigned to fill this information out. Those are the 3 roles that I alluded to. All of the institutions that I spoke with, once again, to reiterate, utilized and filled in all 3 roles and roles within that process and moved forward. I just can't show those to you because, once again, very similar to personally identifiable information, that's certainly institutional identifiable information, and we steered clear of doing that. Once you get all that done, you're now in the home stretch and in the final phases of the process. But that does not mean it's without some additional responsibilities that have to be done. You now return, having completed the eBiz component, back to the overall grants application process, and you log in utilizing the grant numbers, and there'll be 2 grant numbers ultimately, but the one you see here is the grant number for the student portion of the process. You will utilize that to go in and hit the apply button, where you will then be responsible for sharing the certification process as well as a couple of other documents. The SF-424 document, which is the key document that is required by grants.gov, and there is a supplemental to that that you will also need to complete. As a portion of this process, there's been a couple of questions that I know that have arisen. The questions under 6A and B, which ask you to determine what type of institution you are. I believe it's 6A and B. Most people are putting in private, for-profit, private institution of higher education in A, and then for-profit in B as the way they're filling out that information. And then down online, I believe it is 16, it asks specifically for information about your congressional delegation. The best way to deal with that question is either go directly to congress.gov or type in on any Google search, who are my members of Congress? And there's all sorts of search engines where all you have to do is put in your zip code and it'll kick out the information of who those individuals are. There's A and B there. Almost everybody has filled out A and B the same way because it's the same entity and it's the same individuals. All of this information will need to be uploaded along with your certificate and agreement from the student side. One thing that we ask you and remind you to be very, very careful about is in filling out that certification, it asks you for a dollar figure. That dollar figure that you should put in there is the 50% allocation. When you received all of your information, both from a student perspective as well as the institutional perspective, it gives you the overall dollars as well as the 50%, the half that goes to students. You should put the student number, not the whole number, in that application. One of the logical questions is, okay, Tom, I messed up on that. I put the wrong information in. You go back into grants.gov, and there is an ability to go through the system to do updates and changes. You would go in and simply add the new information and the new copy of the form with the appropriate amount of finances that will be included there. We have seen institutions have their information kicked back simply because that one line was inaccurate. So you may either receive that, or you may want to go ahead and review your document and make sure you put the right number in, and if not, just do the update to continue to move the process forward as swiftly as you possibly can, noting that, again, swiftly is a term of art here. This is the process that you would go through. Once again, to do that, here's what you should look at in terms of the loading. Once you have all of them locked and submitted your application, you have the ability to check the status of the application. And again, that status check is where you can also go in and do the modifications if you need to. You do need to repeat this for all three forms. So as you go through this process, be very, very vigilant and diligent to make sure that things are uploading. I have had a number of institutions say they swore that they thought that they had done the download or the upload, only to find that it wasn't there. So you're going to have to make sure and check and recheck the ability to ensure that all of the information is there. Where you can find all of this is if you're looking for the actual grant numbers, it's here as highlighted, and you put in your password and the various information. This is where you could also do the submission if you were doing it linearly as opposed to through Workspace. And then here's where you would find the information specifically for yours. There's the apply button, the almighty apply button that you're trying to get to the end of this process. If you're not ready for prime time yet, this will show up gray as opposed to red. And those are areas that are showing you that something somewhere in this process has not been completed or fully filled out or fulfilled. And you need to go back and try and figure out where that is as we go through the process. I know that's a lot in a relatively short period of time, but it is our attempt to try and share this information with you and go through the process. I do see and have seen a number of questions pop up as I've been going through this. So I will literally, if you indulge me with your patience, I'll start from the beginning and try and see how many of them I can not only get to, but answer. Again, with the recognition that if I can't answer them, what I will attempt to do is then go back and seek support and guidance from my kitchen cabinet of various different other lobbyists, CPAs, and members of the community that have completed the process, as well as the department. How do you register a school that didn't include in that did not get included in the list of allocations of funds, and it is a Title IV eligible school and has been for 5 years? You need to contact your institution's DUNS number first. We have had several circumstances where the institution knows that it has a DUNS number, knows that it's been in existence, has used that DUNS number to draw down FSA, but for some reason the system is not making the connection. The place to start is with DUNS, and make sure that you can then have a copy of your e-car ready. Again, you want to make damn sure that everything comports back to your e-car, and you do not want to mess with your e-car information, because again, that's what establishes your eligibility for federal student financial aid. Will the slides be available? Yes, as always, all of these slides are available on the C-SPEN website, and we will have that information available to you. Having shifted to this new technology and the ability to present this information, we normally get it up on the website within 24 hours, 48 hours, give or take, thanks to Aaron Edwards and Edward Strategies, Edward Schroen Strategies. They have been helpful in supporting us in making sure that oftentimes it gets up much quicker than that. But yes, this is available. Next question, the piece that was posted this week was an additional funding by the department, or was it just a follow-up to how to do the second part? It is how to do the second part. There has been no additional money, and don't get confused, and this is one of the things that I was going to bring up at the very end. Under the CARES Act and the Paycheck Protection Program, there is new money that the Senate just passed on Tuesday and the House passed today that will provide additional money in the form of SBA loans for entities that choose to go through that application process. C-SPEN did a whole webinar on the difference between the PPP, another acronym, versus the HERF back a couple of weeks ago, and we'll be doing another one on an update with all of that next Thursday. Next Tuesday, we're doing one with Pearson on the ability to utilize their website for additional support for helping your individuals, your employees, and your students with navigation and transition to online, because it is unfamiliar territory for many, and that builds off of the other two we've done on distance ed. But next Thursday, Dennis Cariello, myself, and possibly one or two others will provide with the latest update on both the Paycheck Protection Program, as well as any new information on the financing under the Emergency Stabilization HERF funds, and hopefully our first ability to talk about some of the guidance that we expect from policy planning and innovation inside of the department with regard to some of the policy provisions, those including how to deal with R2T4 and the funds that are maintained by the student, even if they withdraw during the COVID pandemic, how to address leave of absences, what to do with other information like the financial responsibility implications as it relates to composite scores, cohort default rates down the line, and many others. So the answer to this short question is the second portion of what was announced 2 days ago is the institutional portion of the second of the two halves to make the collective whole of the stabilization higher education emergency funds. What recipient name should we use if our school name is different from our company name? This is with regard to the funding certification agreement. I have heard that everybody utilizes the institutional names as opposed to the company name. What I believe is the best way to go here is to tie it to the OPEID numbers and the names that are associated once again with the OPEID numbers, because again, those will be on the e-car and tied to the DUNS numbers as well. Can a student portion of funds go to students that are on an approved leave of absence to ensure they can come back to school? This is one where I don't have a definitive answer yet. We recognize that individuals that are on leave of absences have circumstances that require them, like say you're unfortunately had to be put on a leave of absence because of the fact that the clinical or the other off-site types of continuation of those educational programs simply is shut down because of shutter at home or because of the emergency pandemic and the fact that the clinics and others are trying to limit, and the hospitals are trying to limit the exposure beyond truly the first line individuals. We don't know. There is two trains of thought here. One is that they don't want the additional funds potentially to go to students that may or may not return. We still do have, as it stands right now, the 180-day limit on leaves of absence. So even if you're putting an individual on leave of absence for things out of control of you, the institution, the students, or others, until we hear future guidance, which we hope is forthcoming, 180 days is it. The statute did provide for the fact that the student doesn't have to re-enter at the same point that they left off, but it didn't touch and didn't bring anything in terms of information or waivers to bear or discretion to give to the secretary on that statutory requirement of 180 days. So we're hoping that additional statutory guidance and capabilities from the department will potentially address the 180 days. But given that, we don't know whether or not you can utilize funds to sustain an individual through that or not. I hear some people say no, because then you're giving students money when the determination of their return is questionable. But again, the flip side of that is, in doing what's best for the students, you would think that you would want to provide them with access, especially to their student portion, given the fact that that might help to get them through the hurdle. One of the things that I think is favorable towards the ability to give them the funds to be able to maintain even on a leave of absence is the fact that those individuals, and they made clear in the student portion of the questions, that student of the FAQ, that it's Title IV eligible or received individuals. So hopefully we're going to get some additional information, but that's the best I can give you as an answer right now. When you reopen is the follow-up to that question. Certainly, if you open back up and those individuals are no longer on a leave of absence, you would have the ability, especially if, again, they're Title IV eligible or Title IV recipients, to then provide them with funds, which gets to another one of the questions that I've heard and a discussion point. You may very well want to, as you are planning and providing for this, not only be very, very careful and thoughtful in your policies and procedures that you develop as an institution, but part of that may be to ensure that you're not giving all of the funds right now. You have up to a year to provide these funds, and if you have new enrollments, or let's be realistic, you could have existing enrollments that you can look at their circumstances even today, which are considerably different from when they filled out the FAFSA and their initial EFC was determined, that could change yet again. Individuals could still yet have circumstances in the future that are unforeseen right now that would warrant, under your plan, them receiving additional funds. So do you set aside funds for those type of circumstances? Do you set aside funds for future enrollment classes or existing enrollment classes, not knowing when the pandemic is going to end, not knowing when the various states are going to allow for returns of individuals back to the working environment? If those of you who listen to various medias and talk shows, last night Governor Cuomo was on the daily social distancing show and spoke specifically to the fact that he did not think that salons, meaning cosmetology and beauty and wellness type programs, would be considered essential, and even went so far as to say, with social distancing, I don't see me making those essential until the latter half of the phases within New York. Well, he was talking about it from a salon perspective, but what does that say for all of our beauty and wellness institutions and their programs in the New York area? Does that mean that they're going to be on a longer time horizon, potentially even than other forms or other types of institutions of higher education? Please hear me. I didn't say that that was the case, but what I did say was when he is making those kind of general statements about the occupation, what does that potentially portend for the institutions, and what others may or may not be part of that distinguishing line that is blurred anyway between the president's guidance and their 3 phases versus governors each coming up with their own determinations and decisions as well. We'll have to see how it plays out, and it's very likely that a lot of it will play out differently at a state-by-state level as each state and each governor looks at the ways in which they, along with the administration, are returning individuals to the workforce. Is there a specific date when a student must be enrolled with to be eligible for funding? Again, there is nothing definitive other than the March 13th date. The department has put forward different guidance with different requirements. They did extend the ability for institutions to enroll students beyond well into June. So you would think that these funds could potentially be utilized once again, not only for existing students, but for future students. The FAQ contemplates that in terms of both students' scholarships and also funds for enrolled future students, and says that that you can utilize portions of the institutional side to help cover costs related to the pandemic for those students. Again, not the student side. The student side goes to them for COA costs other than tuition and fees, room and board, and the like. Again, I know that many of you that are in the financial aid community are very, very direct in reminding everyone that cost of attendance includes tuition and fees. All I can tell you is that Congress and the department are steadfast in their belief that the 50% that goes to students is for their outside circumstances related to the disruption of the education. And it's not money you should be thinking about touching in any way, shape, or form. If a student has not yet completed FAFSA, can they do it now and receive care funds if found eligible for Title IV? Yes. Again, I would refer you back to the fact that the student portion of this does say that it is individuals who either have received or are eligible to receive. And again, I would look to the payment periods or periods of enrollment that would be post March 13, 2020, in order to once again ensure, and even maybe pre-2020, if it's part of, again, guidance forthcoming from the department. That's one that, again, we may need to wait for additional clarification as we watch these FAQs get more and more concrete in terms of delineations under major subject headings, LOA and R2T4 being one, the disbursement of these aids both from the institutional reimbursement perspective and to the student, again, as it goes forward. Please clarify, programs that are not Title IV eligible, can these students receive CARE Act funds? No. Again, the most recent guidance says very clearly that these funds are for individuals enrolled in and Title IV eligible students. So you have to be the program. It has to be students that are eligible for a fund, which means they have to be in a Title IV program, which means non-Title IV programs are not eligible. If a student does not have a file, I just read that one. Yes, and the follow-up was, how can the institution know if the student has a valid Social Security number or meets the selective service requirements as listed under question number 9? you're simply going to have to ask them for that information. And as is always the case with all of this, and probably cannot be repeated enough, document, document, document. And always look at this again in relation to the ability for the funds to be allowed for the utilization as it relates to disruptions that occurred as a result of the continuation of education as a result of the pandemic. I literally am going to start to put that language up on the edge of my computer because that's the litmus test that the department is putting out in every bit of guidance that they ever put out, and Diane Howard Jones, as well as Assistant Secretary King and others, repeat multiple times in their presentations. Could a school use a portion of their emergency funds to supply instructors with laptops, et cetera, to better teach students? I believe that the definitive answer to that is yes. It's a portion of information technology. It is directly related to disruptions as a result of the pandemic and your need to be able to convert to an online or other forms of modality in order to continue to sustain the educational programs. I'm pretty confident about that one. We just adjusted some schedules so that students had courses to take online. This in turn reduced enrollment status for future terms, and students will lose Pell. Do you think we'll be able to supplement the Pell loss for students with institutional funds? Good question. I know that it talks about in the CARES Act the ability to utilize various other funds, like the ability to utilize works funds and SEOG and move some of those around. Let me get back to you. I think the answer is yes, but I'd rather be more definitive and clarify that first, especially when it comes to the Pell funds and then what you can use the institutional funds for. Certainly, grant assistance is permissible under the institutional side, and you can use that for additional grant aid. But let me go back and check on that one. So I'll get back to you. We plan to use our institutional funds under the HERF almost exclusively to reimburse us for payroll charges for faculty and staff who used to teach at the campus but had to retool to teach online. Is paying the staff and faculty salaries incurred between the 13th of March and June an acceptable use of the funds? I believe so. What the department did talk about on the stakeholder call was that the funds that are institutional funds could not be used for bonuses or other incentives for individuals within the employ of any of the institutions. The generally held belief, and I'm careful with my words here, is that payroll is an acceptable form of what the funds can be utilized for. There are a number of groups that made that interpretation prior to this new guidance, not the least of which was ACE, the American Council on Education. We are awaiting further definitive word because I know for a fact that several people, especially after the discussion around bonuses and other funding was discussed at the most recent stakeholder meeting to try and determine definitively about payroll. So we will get back to you with regard to that as more information comes out as well. Ed stated the school did not need all the funds, could make them available to other institutions. Did Ed say how we decline any portion of the funds? They do not. What they do say is that you have the ability to return those funds. I will tell you, I think that right now they're still more focused on guidance and parameters on how to apply for, successfully receive, and appropriately administer the funds, not necessarily the return of those funds. I would remind you, however, that question number 5 also gives you the ability to utilize the institutional portions for additional grant assistance to your students. I don't know why you wouldn't withhold that money in the instances not only to take care of current enrollments, but for the reasons we already discussed, to potentially help additional students based on your determination of policies and procedures on how to deliver the funds to the students and need, and the ability to hold on and retain those funds at least through the time frame to ensure that all students, or to the degree possible, as many students that are having problems and disruptions as a result of the pandemic, have access to those funds. Just a thought. How can we get the slides? Once again, this slide presentation and the whole presentation is being recorded and will be posted on the C-SPEN website within literally by tomorrow, if not later today. I can't find the notarized letter from the SAM website. I will send that to you sometime later today or tomorrow, so I'll make a note and make sure that that happens. So you know who you are, just expect it from me within the next 24 hours. For SAM registration, you talked about the notarized letter. I did not see where it is. Again, I will do the same thing for that second individual. Can we use the institution funds to pay a third party who will help, such as IT consultant? Again, I refer you directly to number, I believe, hold on, question number 8. It literally speaks directly to that question, and the answer is yes, as long as it is for the as long as it's for online LMS or other educationally related expenses due to the problems with the pandemic, and again, do not include any funds for pre-enrollment activities, marketing, recruiting, and advertising. The question, I think, covers that pretty clearly. We went out of order on this based on misinformation. I'm applying for admin role for SAM. Someone else registered as the organizing. Can any of this be changed or updated? Yes, you can go back into one or both systems and attempt to bring the information forward. SAM would probably, unfortunately, be the best place to start, and that way you have multiple individuals with the capability. Once you get into the grants.gov, I would encourage you to try and keep it all with one person, but again, utilize Workplace for various different individuals to be responsible for the information. The more you can utilize the SAM individual as the one that ultimately reports it in, the easier the process will be, based on my understanding. Keep in mind, guys, I've been through this tutorial with 3 different people about a half dozen to a dozen times, and it's all new to me because I don't do financial aid on a daily basis, but we were trying to give you the best that we can. I hope you give me a little latitude. Your congressional district also listed on the e-car. Is there a deadline to upload the documents? No, there is no deadline. And again, in some of the earlier information that we at C-SPEN put forward, and other attorneys and others have suggested as well, guys, you have some time here to really think through how you're going to utilize these funds, both from a student perspective as well as an institutional perspective. I know you're hurting. I know the need for the money from the student's perspective is tantamount to one of the things you want to try and do, but I submit to you that the more you plan and the more you prepare for how you're going to utilize those funds and how you're going to put in writing how you utilize those and then follow that plan, the better off you're going to be in the long run. That documentation is needed and required. It's what the auditors and others are going to assess you on in the future. So the more you think this through, and to the degree possible, not only write it down for yourselves, but give it to all of the students and then follow it, the better off I think you're going to be in the long run. And you do have time. All of these funds have up to a year to be utilized. So you can take time on both sides. And that's why the frustration I know that's come with trying to cope with getting the registration submitted is a pain in the ass. But take the time to do it. Be thankful for all of your individuals that are toiling away at trying to do it. It is not easy, and continue to work it through, but use that additional time to plan and prepare and use the guidance that is continuing to come out to better inform how you develop those processes and how you might have to amend some of those processes as we all learn more. There were those that believed that non-Title IV eligible students, because they were enrolled at the institution, would be eligible for these funds as well. We've now all come to learn from guidance 2 days ago that's simply not the case. We will obviously learn more as all of this unfolds. If you didn't do it correctly, would you receive an error message? In some instances, yes. In others, not until you get further along in the process when the systems try and tie it to other information that's already available. Can I start my registration process with grants even if my SAM registration is still not approved yet? Yes, but you're going to get to a point where it stops you out because you can't go further in some of the areas, and your submission and your next steps process will remain gray. So until you get the SAMs and some of the other information and complete the SAMs and CAGE process, you can't go back through grants.gov and get to the next phases, including the eBiz process and then the formal submission of all of your forms, portions of the process. So it stops you out at a certain point. You can get only so far. You can fill out some of your forms only so far, but you can't go any further than that, and you can't submit anything. Where that can become helpful is, at least on Workplace, up to certain points, you can complete the forms and some of it's completed for you. You can look at what the others are and be prepared to put those in once you get the SAM's recognition. Will this recorded presentation be sent to us after the webinar is concluded? We'd like for you, candidly, it's hard for us to then turn around and have to resend this out. I will try and make sure that everybody gets this one, but it will be just as easy and candidly easier for Jerry and I, as opposed to having to respond to 249 of you individually. If you could just go to the CSPEN website, centralstatesedu.com, and pull it down yourselves. I hate to be a little bit of a pain there, but please help us, because we're trying to do everything we can, and that would help alleviate us having to respond to potentially 254 requests for something that you can get in 2 clicks on a website. How long does it take after registration with SAMs to get back to grants.gov? 3 days to a week is what I'm hearing is normal time frames. Pestering them by picking up the phone and calling them doesn't really work. I've had a number of people try that and not get very far. So you just have to be patient with that part of the process. And again, utilize that time to review the instructions that go along with the FS 424, the supplemental from the department, get all of those docs in a row, pun intended, and then be prepared for, once you get that information, to then move through the other portions of the process. What are the 2 forms in addition to the certification agreement? The 2 are the SF 424, which is required under grants.gov, and the Department of Education has a supplemental for that. All of those are once again accessible on the department's website, as well as on the grants.gov website. And as you go through the application process, it'll give you access to download those forms or post them on Workplace, so that if you've got more than one person, once again, working on it, all of you can see the forms and fill it in. Some of it is pollinated on its own based on your IRS information, your DUNS information, your ECAR, and elsewhere. What does it mean when your application says agency tracking number assigned? It means that you have completed the process and you are now likely 2 to 3 days away from getting approval and access to the student funds. Congratulations. That means you've successfully gotten through the process, unless there is something that they find that holds it up. We have seen individuals who have gotten the email that you're alluding to that have received funding starting 2 to 3 days later. If I had gotten to the last part and it says processing locked for me for 2 weeks due to weeks, how do I resolve that? For more than 2 weeks, not sure. If you can send me a specific email, send it to tom@centralstatesedu.com, and I will try and get with you and learn a little bit more about the details of what it is that you're alluding to and see what I can do to help. The call on Tuesday said that for institutional funds, all we have to do is upload the certification agreement. Is that accurate? When I click to apply the grant opportunity number, it is the same applications that we had for the student funds. Do we disregard those? Very good question. We're not sure. Since it is exactly the same identical information, there are those of us that are wondering why you would have to go through all of those submission processes again. Those questions have been asked. We are hopeful that you will learn, and we will all learn in the next day or two, that you do not have to do that. But right now, we don't definitively know. Candidly, again, congrats to you, because that means at least you hopefully have gotten through step one, which is the student submission, to move on to step two. There's a lot of folks that haven't gotten that far yet. Where is the eBiz POC registration page? If you go back and look at the information that I provided, you'll see it as literally right under, and here, I'll go back. If you look, this is on the grants page. You go through the normal process. Right there is the login to the eBiz POC. So it's right down below, and you get sometimes it'll come up under this on this side as well, but that's the place to go to look for that. Password and DUNS have been set, but unable to log in as an eBiz. Go back and try the information again. If you had problems, log out and log back in and reboot. Again, sometimes that helps, but you should be able to, if you have successfully done the other portions and got your passwords and the other information and temporary passcodes and other things from the other parts, you should then be able to move on in grants.gov to the EasyBiz POC. If not, again, tom@centralstatesedu.com. Send me an email and I'll try and help you, or get other individuals to help me to help you on what the problem may be. If our school was exclusively online prior to COVID-2019, are we eligible for any of the grant funds? Unfortunately, no. One of the other statements that was made and definitively stated is that these funds are for individuals that once again had issues and were disrupted based on COVID and had to change and move their education. For entities that were totally online, there's no disruption in the education per se, or at least that's the way it's being interpreted. Don't shoot the messenger. And so therefore, those students are not eligible. If you have a hybrid, or if you have students that move from bricks and mortar onto online, those are the individuals that are eligible and the students that are eligible for the funds. What are your thoughts on holding a percentage for future students? I believe that's a prudent step. I will also remind you now and remind everybody information that I think a number of the accountants and others have shared with all of the community. I think that it is a very, very prudent and smart step to keep all of these funds in separate accounts. The 50% that you receive for the students, the 50% that you receive for the institutions. If you received or are going after Paycheck Protection Program funds in a separate account, so that you can clearly delineate and not have questions of the commingling of those funds and then how they're dispersed or administered. You know that there is going to be considerable oversight in the future of how the funds were expended. You don't give out $14.25 billion without asking for a great deal of tracking of where those funds went and how they were utilized, and hopefully successfully utilized. You need to only look to another portion of the CARES Act where it says specifically that $7 million has been given to the Office of the Inspector General and the General Accountability Office in order to track the disbursement and utilization of these funds. So again, document, justify and verify based on the guidance that's given as you look to be able to provide the funds and who they're eligible for. But unfortunately, those students, coming full circle to your question, that are fully and were fully online are not eligible for these funds. And holding it for the future students, again, I think is, to the other part of the question, sorry, I got my questions mixed up, is I think something that is prudent to do. You have up to a year to utilize these funds, depending on how long this lasts. You're certainly going to have more students, unfortunately, with the curve still not flattened, and in some areas with, unfortunately, the uptick coming as opposed to the flattening or the other side, downside of the curve. You're certainly going to probably have utilization for those funds to help other students very much in need as you go forward. I see two different grants under 425. One is institutions of higher education and one is without. One created last week and one yesterday. Do we apply for both? Yeah, that's both. I believe what you're referring to are both part of the two portions of the HERF funds. I don't know that for certain because I'm not in the system right now, but again, shoot me an email and I'll try and work through that with you. Do you know if SAM requires a third-party admin based on transfer of funds from the department to our G5? It is the notary wording required to complete the registration. The notary is definitely required. So you do need to have the notarized documents, and yes, it's a portion of what you're going to need to go through the process. When I apply using Workspace and enter opportunity information, it shows no open opportunity package found. Technical question I don't know the answer to. Send it to me and I will try and help get you through guidance of individuals that have gone through the process to help me to help you. The certificate should have the 50% of funding on it, but on the SF 424 estimated funds, should that be the 100%? No, it should be the 50%. Again, for each of these, it looks at the funding in separate apportionments or separate portions. So I've had that question before, and everybody believes that the number that should go in the SF 424 is the same number that goes in the certification agreement. Again, because that's the funds that you're looking for, and those are the funds that are being recognized. You're already eligible for them, and many people have expressed their frustration to me. It's like, well, Tom, we're already eligible for these funds. We know based on Congress that we're supposed to get them. Why are we having to go through all these hoops? Well, again, because it's a lot of money, and because the federal government needs accountability to go with it. Do the student funds only apply to students that qualified for federal student financial aid? Yes. Can they be distributed to all students in the current program? Yes, if they are either recipients or could have been eligible recipients for federal student financial aid. Does give you the ability to look at individuals who didn't complete the FAFSA but could because they have a social security number or meet the other criterion and would be eligible. Again, that doesn't mean they would be eligible for grant assistance, but they would be eligible for funds under Title IV, which then gives you the ability to give them access to these funds. Can you clarify the HERF institutional funds for tuition? Is this the students that withdrew or more broadly? They don't really cover that as well as you would like in the first FAQ. It's one of the areas that there is some ambiguity or there are different interpretations of the reading of in particularly questions. I think it's 5, 7, and 9. So I would ask your patience and the ability to wait and see more guidance from the secretary and the department as it relates to those funds. Keep in mind, it's probably going to be that long before you get access to them anyway. And I don't mean that to be flippant. I just mean that to notice that the process is going to take a little time, and the department is working very diligently to provide as much information as they can. And I fully anticipate, as we've seen 3 now on the student side in updates of guidance, that we're likely to see more on both the student side and on the institutional side to come in the days and weeks ahead. Can this money be used for students that started after the HERF was put in place? Yes. Again, that's where you can put the money aside as you so choose. We have a year to disperse the funds. That is correct. That's written in the statute and in the guidance. Is there a dedicated help desk number? There are a couple of them. It depends on whether you're talking about a help desk number under DUNS, under SAM, under grants.gov. When you receive various portions of your guidance in the submission process and various emails, you'll see various places where you can go for support. There's the one for grants.gov, and you'll see different ones throughout the guidance that you get. Here's various ones. There's 2 different ones that are included when you get your temporary registration information. See, you can ask for the contact center or for specifically for questions regarding your application or the roles information. So there are different ways in which and different avenues where you can go. And the emails do walk you through some of those steps in the process, as I've come to see some of these filled out as it goes through. Can you use the school portion for payroll? Again, one of the things that we are continuing to wait for is additional prescriptive guidance on the degree to which you can. You cannot use it for bonuses, incentives, or other forms of over and above recognition type issues. That was made unequivocally stated by the secretary and the undersecretary and assistant secretary on Tuesday. But general payroll, we're still trying to figure out. We think that you can, but more guidance is going to be helpful with that particular question. If the school chooses to give money to the students, how long does the school have to do this? Once again, all the funds are to be distributed within a year. If you have several OPEID numbers, can you combine those funding into funding if the OPEIDs are within the same state? Another very good question. While it talks about the utilization of some of the grant assistance and SEOG and other funds in the guidance the department has put forward, it has not given any guidance yet on whether or not if you have multiple OPEID numbers under the same grouping, whether you can share monies between institutions. The current interpretation is probably not, that the intent is for the individuals at that institution, but we'll see whether or not that gets clarified in the degree to which maybe you can. But the interpretations and what I've heard from most people right now is that the conventional wisdom or the recommendations are that, again, you keep this money separated so you can show how you're using it, but you use it tied to the OPEID number that is associated with that particular institution and the students at that particular institution. PPP funds must primarily be used for payroll to be forgiven. You didn't mention that when you spoke about the HERF institutional funds for payroll. That's a very good point. That is a great deal. 75% of the PPP funds have to be utilized for payroll, and payroll to try and sustain where you were at as an entity prior to the start of the pandemic, which means potentially bringing individuals back off of furlough or that were released, or at least the positions still being available and filled going forward. So that is a very, very valid and good point. I'm trying to keep the PPP separate from the HERF funds because, again, I don't want people taking some of the different deadlines and information from HERF and applying it to the PPP or vice versa. So that's why the questions with regarding to payroll and HERF, I'm keeping separate as opposed to what you can do through the PPP. Any additional news on extensions of the annual compliance audits? Very good question. One of the questions that we have received and candidly has been requested of the department multiple times from all the different avenues that you would expect. We have not received any new guidance. We hope to. It was part of, there was an FAQ that was put forward by Policy Planning and Innovation, one of the earlier iterations of the FAQs on the department's website, not on the HERF, but on the COVID instructions with regard to CARES, where they duly acknowledged and noted that this, along with SAP, along with R2T4, and many other portions of the policy, borrower benefits, student benefits, and institutional latitude, that those are things that are going to be forthcoming in the near future. The near future is, once again, not clearly defined. I do not anticipate it being this week. Guidance that I've talked to from people that are in the throes of developing it and going through it say that it's not ready for prime time yet, but they're working on it quite vigilantly, and the amount of time they're putting into it is an indication that when we see it, I think we'll have a lot more clear guidance, but right now we don't have that. Can you please clarify, new students that started classes after President declared an emergency are eligible for funds? Yes, they are. Again, if they meet the criterion of being eligible or filling out the FAFSA, or meeting the criterion to be able to fill out the FAFSA to be eligible for federal student financial aid in a Title IV eligible program. When do you estimate that the webinar from Tuesday will be available? It should be up there now. If it is not, I will work with our technology gurus to make sure that it's up there. It should be. I thought that one literally went up yesterday, but I will check. So if you can check and I'll check, and if not, I'll make sure that it gets up as soon as possible. And the last one that I see here for right now, eBiz, you said, is your UEI, for the UEI is DUNS plus 4 zeros. Yeah, that's just the way it seems to come back. It's not that, it's not any great shakes, but just because you get that, you've still got to go through the process in order to get your password that goes along with it. So you can't just put in that information and move along. You've got to go through the steps in the process, but that's what it ultimately ends up being as your part of your 9. And again, just so happens I'm on the page, there's where it'll give it to you, and you'll note that's what it looks like. That's what it's looked like on everyone that has come back. Can a consolidated and simplified checklist of items to complete be provided? We're trying to do that, but the problem with that is it's not going to be the same for everybody. We're going to try and go a little bit further than where we have here, but we hope that this has been helpful and valuable to you as we endeavored to try and do what we could. But we'll try and see what we can do to come up with something even shorter and tighter, recognizing that it might not fulfill everybody's needs, but maybe could be another helpful document. Can future students get grants but must be used for expenses related to disruption? Yes, all of these funds are related to the disruption. So again, you have to preface all of this by that overarching statement. Is there anything addressing what happens if while we are working on how we will allocate the student funds, students who are currently attending now graduate? Good question. I think that, let me go back to the department on that one, because I don't see, or I don't recollect in my readings of both of these documents that it really talks about recent graduates. So let me go back and look at that and get back to you. With that, we are now at 5 minutes past our 3:30 time frame. There are a couple of other questions. I'm sorry for those of you that I didn't get to, but what we will do is, again, try and put this together with all of these questions and short noticed answers, but it takes a while for me to process through all these and do that. We'll try and lump them together, and what I'm trying to do is lump them together for similar questions and just do 1 or 2 of them, and then provide the answers. We want to thank you for participating on today's webinar. We hope that they is of value to you, and as we continue, and I and Jerry and the community continue to all strive to do our best to understand, review, interpret, and move forward based on the guidance with literally uncharted waters here in a number of respects. Please share your information. If you get new things that you're aware of that are for the benefit of the community, please share them. We are open to making sure, and our goal, as we've always strived to do, is to provide timely, accurate, sourceable information to help the entire community. We hope to do that again next week, as I said, with the next 2 installments of our webinars. One will be with Pearson, where they will go through portions of their website to show where they have done a lot of complementary services for individuals, employees, as well as students that we wanted to share with you, as again, we all become more and more immersed in the utilization of technology and the protections that we need to do, ADA compliance as well, and some of the other things that we've already discussed. And then on Thursday, myself and at least 1 or 2 other lobbyist panelists to kind of give you, again, a panel discussion of what all of us are hearing, where maybe yet again we go through some of these questions and I utilize them as the ability to hear if others have got references or difference in the information difference to myself. I'm hoping, don't quote me on this yet, but I'm hoping to get one of the key individuals from NASFA to be on that panel as well, because one of the places I would strongly encourage you to continue to looking at is NASFA. They've done a heck of a lot of work on their own with regard to the CARES Act and all of these different things. Justin and the crew over there have been doing a number of blogs as well as postings on their website and new information. It's a resource that I open up and I have bookmarked every day, as well as the department's site and 1 or 2 others. So I would strongly encourage you to look there for some of the continuation of information that helps the community. With a little bit of a hoarse voice after an hour and a half talking, I do want to say thank you. I do hope that all of you are suffering through, but managing and going through healthy and safe. For those of you who have individuals that are unfortunately COVID symptoms related individuals, thoughts and prayers are with you, as they are with all of our students and all of our community as we continue to go through day by day. Stay well, stay safe, and we'll talk to you soon.